Our next speaker is Carolyn Hyppolite. She's the author of Still Small Voices. She's going to tell some part of her story, but how that book came to be. And welcome to the stage, Carolyn Hyppolite.
I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much. I've entitled my speech today, Setting the Captives Free, Why Critiquing Religion is a Compassionate Act. In my mid-20s, I had a religious conversion, and I would spend the next 8 years intensively, desperately trying to attain some notion of sanctity. I wanted to be a saint. In the pursuit of sanctity, I gave up much of the goods of life. I committed to premarital celibacy. When I was working full-time, I gave hundreds of dollars a month to church or to religious-based organizations. I spent hours a day in prayer or going to daily mass, more hours a week on Sunday service, or volunteering for a religious-based organization, such as an anti-abortion group, which used guilt and deception to compel women to not have abortion. Most tragically, I spent years learning dead languages and studying a non-subject so that I can better understand something that simply isn't so. On the Sunday morning that I realized that I would never return to church, I woke up feeling robbed of time, effort, and money. Most distressingly for me was the acknowledgement of how my mind had received and assented to notions that are just obviously mad. I felt like a fool. And it would occur to me soon after that while I had been a passionate and vocal fool for Christ, I had rarely met an equally passionate and vocal non-believer who challenged me on the demonstrably false and irrational notions which formed my worldview. Despite all the complaints about radical fundamentalist atheists, during my 8 years as a Christian, there was only one atheist who actually ridiculed me. Now, don't get me wrong, I was a Christian. And as a Christian, I had a healthy dose of martyr complex. I felt victimized all the time. There was one time that I tried to use the public parks here in Canada to arrange proselytizing events for my church. And when I discovered that I couldn't, I felt victimized. There was another time when I was yelled at for trying to trick a woman into not having an abortion, and I felt oppressed. Oh, and there were those times when Christian biblical scholars tried to teach me about the many textual and historical errors in the Bible, and then I was absolutely sure that I was under demonic attack. However, despite my oversized capacity for self-pity, enhanced by belonging to a community eager to discover evidence that the devil is mad at you and sending his godless minions after you, the fact of the matter is my unhealthy worldview remained mostly unchallenged. No one ever asks, well, how do you know that? Or, what evidence can you offer for that to support that claim? Or simply, exactly how would your consciousness persist beyond the death of your body? Most non-believers who encountered my religiosity, probably because I was trying to convert them, simply smiled and said, well, if that brings you peace, that's great. These responses were politely condescending. They failed to take seriously that I was a person who was capable of wrestling with difficult truths. I spent years living in a deceptive system that when put into practice, oh, in practice I did, is actually quite psychologically abusive without ever really facing real challenges. Now, perhaps I am speaking to the choir. You're presumably here because you understand that religion can be quite harmful. However, often when we think about the harm that religion does, we focus on the external victims of religion. We focus on homosexuals who are discriminated against. or atheist bloggers being murdered, or bloggers being arrested and flogged, as we've just heard about. We focused on children who are denied the opportunity to receive a fact-based science education in parts of the United States. However, I'd like to posit today that the first victim is actually the believer, and that it is an act of respect and compassion to challenge that person with a dose of truth and reason. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus said, or Jesus is reported to have said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set the oppressed free." And I'd like to say to you today that Christianity has not brought good news to the poor, but instead has made them vulnerable to exploitative institutions that extract the little that they have. It has not set prisoners free, but has created societies where oppressions and prisons abound. It has not given sight to the blind, but has caused some believers to linger in illness and condemned millions to intellectual blindness. It has not set the oppressed free, but rather has led to needless psychological oppression caused by cultures of guilt and shame in which people are compelled to hate their own flesh. First, let's start with money and Christianity. It should be obvious to all of us here that the billions of dollars invested globally into building and maintaining the religious structure is a problematic use of our finite resources. However, what is most pernicious about this misallocation of material resources is that it disproportionately burdens the poor. The correlation between poverty and religious adherence is astoundingly high. According to the 2010 Gallup poll, in nations where per capita income is $2,000 or less, 95% of those questions said that religion is an important part of their daily lives. That number drops significantly to 47%, where per capita income is at or above $25,000. Thus, we find that where desperation is the greatest, in places such as Bangladesh, Niger, Malawi, Indonesia, 99% of citizens say they are religious. Conversely, in countries where people enjoy a high standard of living, such as Sweden, Denmark, and Japan, less than a quarter say they are religious. And the relationship between religion and poverty is simply too complex for me to go into here, and I'm not necessarily saying that religion causes poverty. However, we have good reason to think that religion exploits the poor. It exploits their desperation and their need for hope. A recent study by the Leadership Network in the United States found that in regions of the country with the lowest income had the best paid preachers. Now, in the United States, where GDP is high but income inequality is quite low, the parasitic relationship between the church and the poor is quite obvious as one drives through urban ghettos and post-industrial towns. In many parts of the most economically challenged areas with high concentration of African Americans, the only economic institution still standing in some neighborhoods might be a liquor store and a church. In such setting, prosperity preachers abound and they preach an exploitative message. God will bless you financially after you give money to the church. That there are hundreds of millions of poor people all over the world being exploited this way is a very good reason to challenge the church's claim to be serving the poor. In addition to exploiting poverty, religion should be challenged because it negatively correlates with pro-social behavior. Far from setting the captives free, religion is positively correlated with incarceration. As non-believers, we've all experienced people challenging our morality, Poll after poll show that people believe atheists are immoral or devil worshippers. To whatever extent incarceration is a measure of one's morality, it is atheists who have a higher moral ground. Now, I'm sorry I don't actually have Canadian numbers on this, but in the United States, atheists are terribly underrepresented in the prison population, making up less than 1% of that population. Again, this is not to say that religion causes people to commit crime, but it might be that by encouraging a society where people are better educated and have better economic opportunity, we increase their productivity and decrease the likelihood that they'll engage in antisocial behavior. You might also be aware that non-belief is positively correlated with education. We can also conclude that Jesus does not set the captive free by noting the fact that the more religious a society is, the more likely it is to criminalize normal human behavior. Most religious societies are likely to penalize the use of recreational drugs, homosexual activity, and in some cases, religious dissent. Our highly religious neighbors to the south boast the highest prison population in the world, with 4.4% of the world's population, but 22% of its prison population. Over 2 million men, women, mostly black, mostly religious, and mostly in prison for non-violent drug possession. This is not a coincidence. Religion seems to make people more conservative and more likely to want to be tough on other people. Far from increasing one's sense of compassion, religious increases one's punitive instincts. A few months back, I was speaking to my very religious sister about this fact, and I noted the fact that religious people are more likely to support the death penalty. She lives down in Georgia. And she rightly pointed out, religious people believe in punishment. Now, this preference for punishment over compassion is not only not extended to others, but first and foremost towards the self. Religious people are caught in a web of guilt and shame. Having been raised in restrictive environments, their repressed natural urges often leads to cycles of acting out in shame. You may have heard of some recent hypocrisy coming from the Duggar family recently. That's the cycle of repression, hypocrisy, and shame that religious forces you into. So, for example, Christians are about as likely to engage in premarital sex as non-Christians, but they often find themselves living in cycles of guilt, repentance, and backsliding. The culture of shame around sexuality means often couples do not acquire contraception because buying a condom or getting on the pill would mean that you're planning to sin. And so for some reason, it's better to fall into sin, wink, wink, than to actually plan to do it. Now, women trapped within these religious cults are often experience unplanned pregnancies, sometimes choosing abortion, thus exacerbating the cycle of guilt and shame. Human sexuality is perhaps the area where churches do the most damage. When I was first a Christian, I freely admitted to my father of confession, that is the person who regularly hears your confession, that I found celibacy very hard, and that I often sinned by falling into inappropriate outlets, mostly masturbation. And the priest assured me that this was normal, but that in time, through prayer, fasting, and regular confession, that I would overcome. So I did as I was instructed. I prayed, I fasted, I went to confession once or twice a month. Yet, I still found myself falling into the same temptation and running back to the confessional. Now, 7 years later, I explained my problem to a different priest, and he assured me that in time, through prayer, fasting, and regular confession, I would overcome. As I listened to him, I remembered my previous confession, but I had prayed, I had fasted, I had shared my most personal and embarrassing failings to a man in a dress regularly. And yet, I did not overcome. Where was God's grace? At the time, I was already having doubts in other areas, and this was just one more indicator that there was something very wrong with my worldview. Often when we talk about the problems that religion poses, we focus on the most egregious abuses, especially religious violence. However, many of the most tragic aspects of the God delusion is all the little ways that God can rob you of the very limited moment you have in consciousness. All the ways that it steals your time and efforts by trapping you in moral and intellectual dead ends. This is the real and often unchallenged cost of religion. All of the time wasted smashing one's face against the brute facts of reality over and over again. All of those hours of a short life, all of the time prostrating, reciting prayers, waving incense, in hopes that an invisible silent being might change the laws of nature or probability in your favor. And this, the way that religion robs us of time, deserves to be challenged. When you encounter a Christian, especially a devoted one, keep in mind that you are talking to somebody who's often been disappointed by a being who does not exist. This is especially the case for the most committed believer. The more confidently someone speaks about his or her faith, the more likely it is that she has had numerous occasions to be disappointed by it or wounded by it. But having invested so much of herself, it is hard to admit that the struggle is futile, that the constant stream of unanswered prayers is a sign of a silent heaven. The believer is more inclined to doubt the strength of her faith or the righteousness of his own life, instead of acknowledging that she is simply wrong about God. And this, the way that religion robs the believer of emotional health by compelling otherwise rational human beings to talk to an empty room, deserves to be challenged. At the heart of a Christian faith is both a false and damaging idea. It is the idea that we, you and I, are so broken that God had to take on human form to be tortured. No matter how ethical the believer is, he is compelled to believe that if he were the only person on earth, Jesus would have loved him enough to die for him. But the implication of that is he would have needed to be died for. And this, the way religion saddles so many well-intentioned people with guilt and shame, forcing them into lives of hypocrisy, needs to be challenged. For thousands of years, religion has slowed down our pursuit of knowledge, has fed our basest temptation by compelling us to use violence against sinners or virgins, has saddled us with guilt by vilifying the healthiest aspect of our humanity, has created opportunities for charlatans to make false promises, especially to the most ill-educated and ill-fortunate. This deserves to be challenged. There are billions of people trapped in prisons of ignorance, delusion, and needless guilt. Many of them are great people. They're bright, they're kind, they're generous, they're thoughtful, but they are wrong. They are wrong in ways that harm themselves and others. Let us actually set the captives free by calling them on their bullshit. Thank you. Happy to take your questions.
Just a couple of comments, but then I'll end it with a question.
Okay.
The comment is kind of touching on a couple of things that you've mentioned. One is views of sexuality. There has been this, obviously everybody knows about this breaking story about the Ashley Madison leaks.
Right.
And I just find it interesting how there's been many comments about how people think it was wrong for the leak to happen, but that they don't feel particularly sorry for the people whose information is out there, and frankly, for a lot of them, for whom it's going to destroy their lives.
Right.
And I just have found it interesting to think about how much of that reaction comes from a dominant Judeo-Christian worldview and the perspective on marriage and on the nature of promises
Sure.
and the nature of sexuality. Because I imagine that there's a lot of people who enter into marriage because that's the only
Sure.
venue for them to have intimacy.
Absolutely.
And I think it's difficult for people to come out and say that the people who leaked that information, it was disgusting for them to do that.
Right. I think some
But
people
then, so just to end it with a question, a broader issue that comes out of that is, what is your perspective on the role of truth-telling? Because having been raised as a Christian, and even just in generally in society, even for probably a lot of atheists, I think the idea is to be truthful is the best. And I'm coming around to thinking that that's not true. And I'm wondering if
What depends?
that's not the best way of doing it. And I'm wondering if you think that being truthful is important. Obviously it is, but how so?
Yes, it's important, but there's private information that needs to be kept that way, and I think it is a problem to reveal somebody's personal failing. And I have to admit that I've been laughing about the Josh Duggar thing, but it's not something that I would have done, right? I think you shouldn't reveal other people's. So I have friends who are still in church who will come to me and admit sexual indiscretion outside of marriage. And they're not married at all, so this is just, again, lots of outlets, and there aren't a lot of people that they can admit this to. So, and it's not for me to out that person and said, well, so-and-so is in your church and so-and-so is leading worship, but they're doing X, Y, Z, because, it doesn't involve a minor, it doesn't involve anything that I need to report. But there is a different kind of truth-telling where I need to say, both to that person and to the religious community that creates this environment, you have a problem. This is the third time we've talked about a guy this year. Perhaps it's time you reconsider how you're thinking about sexuality in light of your own personal experience. And that kind of truth-telling is appropriate.
Thanks.
Sure.
I just wanted to make a comment to express my appreciation for your main point that the best way to respect the believers to call them on their bullshit, because a main theme of this, of why we're here, is to discuss, when dealing with issues of blasphemy and respect for religion and something like that, we have to resist the temptation to knuckle under to being polite and never criticizing religion. You are saying that the best way of respecting is indeed to make those criticisms, right, and to make them well. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Hello. First off, thank you for a beautifully spoken and truly entertaining presentation today. So, given some of your personal experiences and transitions that you have worked through, I would be very appreciative to hear your insight on challenging family members on their beliefs when you tend to be a anomaly within your family for beliefs as a humanist or an atheist, and how to, perhaps if you have personal experiences, how to handle doing that with a respectful undertone that allows you to still be a family without hostilities and judgment.
Sure. I would say by simply, we all know how to speak respectfully, by being respectful, but there are going to be these opportunities simply because your Christian mom is really worried about you going to hell, and she's going to bring this up, even though she promises that this is the last conversation we're ever going to have. It's not. And And there are just opportunities to say things that are very personal. For me, I was so involved in it. Like, I know how much God lets you down. Like, people will tell me, like, I have friends who are like, God promised me that I would meet my husband in 4 years. Like, it's very specific. And you can, when you're having a conversation, say, you know, you've been praying about this for quite some time. Make it a question. What happened to that promise? What do you think, where do you think you are with God now since it's been 6 years and you haven't met him? And that's not rude, and that's not even giving them an answer. That's not saying nanny boo-boo, you know. It's just, here's a question, and let them go home and wrestle with that. I like to just ask, you know, have you read that part in the Bible where Jephthah sacrifices the virgin? What do you think about that? Do you think that was okay? So you don't think it's okay to sacrifice virgins? Why do you think that's there? And they're probably not going to answer you at that moment, but let them sit with that question. And I think that's what would have, because what really nagged me is, you know, I sat, like that story of Jephthah, I sat with it for years. Like, I remember the first time I read it, I was just stunned. But I just sat with it, and I prayed about it, and I sat with it, and after a while, like, I simply couldn't make it okay. Like, I couldn't rationalize it. So just ask a gentle question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome talk. I did want to just give you comments and give you big round of applause for myself for speaking out about this, because I actually did what you asked along about 5 months ago or so and called out a faith healer online.
Yeah. Good for you.
Wait for it. Not done. He sued me
Oh,
for
wow.
doing so. It's America, everybody. It happens. And he ended up having to take down his website, his Facebook page, all of his videos, and he ended up dropping his lawsuit.
Oh, good.
Because
That's wonderful. Good for you.
facts win. And it's because of ideas like that it's because of ideas like this that
Thank
that
you.
happens.
I'm glad.
So
That's a
thank you.
wonderful story. Thank you. And think about all of those people who are no longer going to be exploited, who are no longer going to be writing those big checks. So you're doing them a huge favor.
Hello, I'm pro-life and I'm an atheist, and I've got the pro-life humanist table over there if anyone wants to come say hi. You mentioned that you had to lie to women to help them to not have an abortion, and like I've never been in a position where I've helped a lot of women through unplanned pregnancies and given them the resources they need, and I'm just curious what you mean when you say you lied to women.
Yeah, see, in Canada, you guys have semi-sane laws, so you don't, sometimes you just don't understand. The crazy things happen down south. In America, you can erect a building that looks and sounds like it's an abortion building, but it's not. And so my role in this organization was I volunteered on Saturdays to answer the phone as a receptionist, and women would call in seeking abortion, and I would evade answering their questions to bring them in. So if they said, how much do you charge for an abortion? I would say an abortion can run, and I would give a price that is true for Chicago, but clearly not true for me since I was not doing any abortions. And then we would bring them in and give them a pregnancy test and sort of guide them through what was supposed to appear like, so when you have an abortion in many places, you're supposed to talk to a counselor. So it was supposed to look like a counseling session, but it was designed to sort of steer you. Now, I'll tell you how good we were at this. We would counsel women into not having their abortion, and 2 years later, they would bring a girlfriend to have an abortion, not realizing that we were never going to give them an abortion. So that was quite deceptive. Occasionally, people would kind of realize, no, I really want this abortion, and pick up on what we were doing, and they get pretty mad. But we managed to deceive about 50% of the women who came to us looking for an abortion ended up not having it.
Thank you.
Hi there. I'd like to, again, thank you for your wonderful speech. It was fantastic. My question for you is more about having to deal with people of faith when you are challenging them, because I know that a lot of people with faith tend to have a lot of self-shame. So they come from a position of shame, and when you challenge them, they might react defensively out of that shame. Even from your own experience, how would you approach that in terms of challenging them in a way that maybe will not get their backs up right, I suppose?
So when I am dealing with somebody one-on-one, especially if it's an area of shame. So for example, they're holding up a particular view of sexual morality, but I know about their personal failings. I don't say anything to augment that shame. So I don't say, well, aren't you a hypocrite? Or, don't you, do this and that. But I really sort of try to help them reflect on, why do you think you engage in that? How is that working for you? Where is God in this? They're just questions that don't invalidate or insult what their experiences or sort of make them feel worse about what they've done or what they think, but that really just sort of ask them to reflect on their own behavior in a way that's more positive, right? So it's like, I believe, so if I ask you, what do you think about the story where the prophet curses the children and they're mauled by bears? I have enough faith in your morality to know that you understand that that's a problem. And so I ask it anticipating that you're going to reflect on that problem without saying, how can you believe such a stupid thing? But, just tell me, how does that resonate with your idea of a loving God? And mostly people stammer, but stammering is good. Like, stammering is how, is what they're going to take with them. But sometimes, if that comes off as really aggressive, then yeah, people put their walls up, and then you don't get anywhere.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.